Welcome. Today in Limnology, we're going to discuss the first of two topics on high conductivity limnology, so limnology in saline systems. And today's topic is estuarine ecology. Estuaries are places where rivers meet the sea or where limnology meets oceanography. So we're just going to briefly discuss estuarine ecology today. And the first thing we're going to do is define estuaries. Estuaries are where freshwater drainages meet the sea. They are places where you have semi-enclosed bays where rivers meet drainage from other drainage from land, and those mix with ocean water as tides come in. And they've traditionally been places where human habitation has been quite heavy because you have freshwater sources for drinking water and you have nice harbors for ports and so forth. So they often have a lot of human habitation, and many major cities are on estuaries, New York, London, Tokyo, for instance. And so these have both freshwater and marine influences. Lots of human impacts that we'll discuss at the end today. So estuaries are extremely productive ecosystems, and this is just a rough estimate of the productivity in terms of the kilocalories that are produced per surface area per year. And if we look at this, you can see that estuaries are almost as productive in terms of this productivity as wet tropical and subtropical forests, and much more productive than most other systems, including more productive than much fossil fuel subsidized agriculture. So one reason that we're interested in estuaries is their traditionally high productivity in an undisturbed estuary. And that productivity is derived from several sources. We've talked about allochthonous versus autochthonous sources before. So allochthonous sources are those that are produced outside of the system itself, and autochthonous sources are those from within the system. And so the allochthonous sources coming from elsewhere that bring productivity to the estuary are coming from the rivers, so things that are washed down from the freshwater systems we've been discussing, and they're also brought from the surrounding land and watershed. And often the detritus that flows in from the dead material from these external systems, both freshwater and terrestrial, are the base of this estuarine food web. Many things rely on consuming that detritus, just like in the stream ecosystems we've discussed. There also are sources of primary productivity within the estuary itself, and these include phytoplankton, such as in the lakes we've talked about, and seagrasses that are marine higher plants similar to the macrophytes we talked about in lakes, and macroalgae, which are larger algae like seaweeds that are common in the saline parts of estuaries. Estuaries provide a whole number of what we call ecosystem services to humans. So various kinds of processes and materials that humans rely on. And these include some food products that are based on organisms living in estuaries. So for instance, oysters and your blue crabs and many fish have life cycles where they are living in estuaries, and we're harvesting these organisms from there. In addition, estuaries are a nursery habitat for many other fishes and crustaceans such as shrimp, and we'll mention this later again, that are useful as food for humans. And often estuaries are lined with fringing salt marshes that filter nutrients and contaminants, and these would be something we discuss more in marine ecology than limnology. And finally, because these provide a barrier system and often have shorelines that help prevent storm effects directly on inhabitants behind the estuaries, these are safe harbors and shoreline protection for human buildings. The main physical characteristic of estuaries goes with this high conductivity, high salinity concept, and that is that salinity in estuaries is really the defining parameter. And it's not just that it's high salinity, because it doesn't have to be high salinity, it's that it's variable salinity. So the salinity in estuaries has the most variation in salinity of any system that we study in aquatic science. And that variability is horizontal as you go from from the river toward the ocean, and it's vertical as you go from the surface down to the bottom, and it's also seasonal as you get different amounts of freshwater input from the watershed, different amounts of river runoff that's coming into the estuary and making it less salty versus the tides and the ocean flow that tend to be more consistent. So there's this huge variability in salinity that really defines the physical characteristics of the estuary and can make it very difficult for organisms to live in the estuary. So a lot of organisms have very specific traits that help them adapt to this variation in salinity. And another thing that can cause variability in estuaries is just in summer and hot periods, you can have evaporation that also makes estuaries more saline. So we can classify estuaries in a number of ways, and if you're taking a marine ecology or oceanography course, you'd learn a lot more about this. But essentially, briefly, the classification of estuaries is often driven by the pattern of the salt and fresh waters mixing. And we can define a salt wedge as this place where fresh and marine waters meet. And so you know from our basic properties of water discussions that salt water forms a wedge beneath fresh water because salt water is denser than fresh water. And as we have tides moving salt water in, and you can imagine in this diagram the tides going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, that you're going to have the salt water going beneath the fresh water and making this salt wedge. And you'll have some mixing and turbulence at the interface between the fresh river water that's floating on top of the dense seawater. And there are many different ways that this can mix or not mix, and that the salt and freshwater can meet. And estuarine ecologists will differentiate different estuaries based on these patterns. But for us right now, it's important that we realize that fresh water from the river just floats on top of this high salt water, high density salt water. So here's a little 3D example of that, and you can get a good example here of the horizontal and vertical salinity gradients that you might see in an estuary as you go from the river side to the seawater side, the ocean side. And as you go from the surface to the bottom, you go from fresh to salt water, especially at that interface where the river is meeting the sea. And as you go from the ocean end to the river end, you go from a saltier to a less salty area. And so you can imagine if you were a freshwater or saltwater organism living in an estuary, if you were a benthic organism, as exemplified by the little letter A here in this diagram, you might be living at the bottom, and as the tides are coming in and out, you might go from, something on the order of 25 practical salinity units or parts per thousand seawater up to something almost 15 parts per thousand or practical salinity units as the tides go in and out. So you might have a really large change, almost a third change in salinity just during the course of tides running in and out. And if you were something living on shore, you might become dried as the tides come in and out. That's little point B. Or if you look at the upper graph, you might be submerged in either high or low salinity water. So organisms that are living at this boundary between limnology and oceanography, between fresh and salt water, can really experience rapid changes in salinity and also periodic drying, which isn't something that is that common, say daily drying, which isn't that common in other freshwater systems. It's more representative of something like an intertidal system where you'd see daily drying. We've talked about drying in the context of reservoirs and in the context of seasonal patterns in streams and lakes, but not as a factor that occurs most often in freshwater systems. Another common physical characteristic of estuaries is that they are characterized by really soft, muddy substrate. And just as the productivity can come from out of the estuary or within the estuary, the substrate can come from terrestrial sources blown from the watershed or brought from the rivers downstream in turbid discharge, or it can come from the ocean brought with the tides and with strong storms. And often you'll see in very turbulent areas of the estuary, fine sediments are going to be washed away, and in very calm areas of the estuary, fine sediments will accumulate. And these estuaries traditionally would have been places where storms would greatly reshape the pattern of river and tidal interplay. So you would have storms that came and could move all this soft sediment around, and estuaries would move really long distances around the landscape. So say the Hudson River might not discharge the same way into the Sound as in 1 year as it would 100 years later due to a big storm. And what we've done as humans when we build our cities on these estuaries is prevent that reshaping, because we tend to harden those estuaries, and that's altered the characteristics of estuaries as we prevented this sort of natural change and movement of the sediments and of the rivers. And we'll start discussing rivers and reservoirs and management later in the course, but estuaries are part of this control where we've changed the natural pattern of movement of rivers and movement of harbors. So the salinity fluctuations in the water column are really dramatic, and here you can see the up and down curve of salinity versus time as the tides are coming in and out of what's called the bottom water, the water right above the mud. And you can see that the salinity is high when the tide is in, and then lower when the tide is out, and then high again. If you're an organism living in the mud itself and burrowing in the mud, that gets buffered by the fact that it takes a long time for the water that's overlying the mud to percolate into the mud. And so organisms that are in the sediments may have a much more constant salinity that they're exposed to than organisms that are on the surface of the sediment or in the water itself. So that can be one buffering means for an organism in terms of the salinity factors that are causing them to have osmotic problems. They can burrow in the sediments and be exposed to much more constant salinity. Another key physical characteristic of estuaries is flushing time. And that would be the amount of time that it takes a molecule of water to enter and leave the estuary and be replaced by a new molecule of water. And we've mentioned flushing time or retention time in other aspects of the course. And this is much the same definition as you've had in those other systems. How long does a particular molecule stay in that system before it's replaced? And flushing time in estuaries is determined in large part by wave action and by currents and by the amount of river flow. So it may change seasonally. It also may change based on storm patterns and so forth. But if you have an estuary where water stays in the estuary for long periods of time, that can allow plankton populations to build up to high numbers there without the plankton being flushed to sea. However, it also can allow contaminants and pollution to build up there without it being flushed or washed away. And so the flushing time of an estuary can be very important both for the amount of productivity, autochthonous productivity that occurs within the system, and for the potential for contaminants to either remain in the system or be flushed out and diluted into the sea. Estuaries are also characterized often by high turbidity. We mentioned how large rivers, as they get to estuaries, often carry a high sediment load, and a number of you had seen the Hudson River and think of it as a fairly turbid or particle-laden river. And often this resuspension of particles by the flow of the river water is high, and so they carry this high particle load. And as you can see in this picture, that would then obviously be something that interferes with the penetration of light into the estuary. And so there are patches of the estuary closer to the river, especially after storms, where it will be very turbid water, not clear at all, and light will not penetrate deeply. And so that would limit the autochthonous production in the estuary as light penetration is reduced. Oxygen is also a very important characteristic that can vary in estuaries, often with high mixing due to both river inflow and due to the tide movement. You end up getting pretty high oxygen concentrations in the surfaces of estuaries. However, if you have a salt wedge that's trapped beneath fresh water for a long period of time, this can operate just like the epilimnion and hypolimnion of a lake that we've mentioned in class and learned about. And so just like like in the bottom of a lake where you can have oxygen being lost due to decomposition and not being replaced because the bottom waters are not exposed to the atmosphere. If a salt wedge is trapped beneath fresh water for a long period of time, the bottom salty layer of the estuaries can become anoxic or have no oxygen, or hypoxic, low oxygen, during that stratified period. And especially with these organic muddy sediments that are high in organic matter, all of those decomposition processes that you've learned about in class are occurring there. And so there's a high oxygen demand at the sediments that also can contribute to the bottom of the estuary having waters that are quite anoxic or hypoxic. And that can be detrimental to organisms that live on the bottom. So especially the higher the productivity of the estuary, if we have pollution that's increasing the productivity of the estuary, we may get algal blooms that contribute to this. And so this is a good diagram to illustrate that. If we have a lot of people living around the estuary and we're releasing sewage that has high nutrients, as you guys remember, high nitrogen and high phosphorus into the estuaries, that will cause algal blooms. And those algal blooms then will die and sink to the bottom. And if that salt wedge is stuck below the fresh water and not being exposed to all of the oxygen in the atmosphere to allow replenishment of oxygen, then you're going to end up with low oxygen or hypoxia. And so fish may be able to flee to other parts of the estuary where there's oxygen to swim away. But if you're a shellfish or a crab that's stuck on the bottom, they may actually die. You may have die-offs due to this decreased oxygen in the bottom. And that could reduce the ability of, say, crabbers or oystermen to harvest food from your estuary. There are a number of species that live in estuaries. However, because of these harsh conditions of estuaries, because of this salinity and these tidal fluctuations and the potential for changes in oxygen, we have a number of species that are not able to live in the brackish water of the estuary. So we have some various kinds of estuarine residents that we'll talk about. First, in terms of sort of functional types, and also in terms of some of the adaptation of them. So the number of estuarine species tends to be less than in the marine or river systems. And the composition that you get and the types of animals and plants that live there is related to whether you're closer to the freshwater end or the saltwater end. And here's a picture of a common estuarine fish and a fringing salt marsh that is really common on an undisturbed estuary. And so we see here that you can divide organisms several ways as we go from the salinity being freshwater at the river end on the left to the salinity being closer to that of seawater at 33 to 35 practical salinity units on the right-hand side of this graph. We tend to see a change in estuarine fauna from freshwater species in the river inside to marine species as you get to the ocean side, and that's not too surprising. Most freshwater species don't tolerate water that's salinity higher than about 5 practical salinity units, 5 parts per thousand. And many marine species are intolerant of lower salinity as well. So you see stenohaline species at both ends. Stenohaline species, halide is salt, so narrow salt tolerant species occur at both ends of this transition. Those that are narrowly freshwater tolerant and those that are narrowly marine tolerant. And so those will be lost as you move into the brackish water in the middle of the estuary. Then we have some species that are what we call euryhaline, or able to tolerate a broad range of salinities. And many of those are marine species that are able to tolerate fresher water. And some of them, a small number, are actually brackish water specialists or estuarine specialists that are able to exist in the marsh. And so you can see the fewest number of species here are in this brackish water part of the estuary between about 5 and 15 practical salinity units. And then we switch to riverine species as we get to the freshwater side, and marine species as we get to the saltwater side. So here are brackish water specialists especially, generally between 5 and 15 to 18 practical salinity units. So what are the adaptations that these organisms have that permit them to live in variable salinity, these euryhaline species or brackish water species? There are 2 different general things that can occur. You can have an osmoconformer or an osmoregulator that's able to live in a range of salinities. If an osmoconformer is present, that species, as the name implies, its osmotic concentrations conform to that of the external environment. So the osmotic concentration of their internal fluids is going to vary, as it shows on here. If it were a perfect osmoconformer, it would vary directly with the salinity of the water. And so here this polychaete worm on this chart shows you near perfect osmoconformer. As the salinity of water increases, the salinity of blood increases. And that these organisms, even though their blood salinity and their fluid salinity varies, they're able to tolerate that and not have detrimental effects from that variance. Alternatively, species may actively regulate their internal salinity, and these are called osmoregulators, and so that costs them energy. They actively transport ions to maintain a favorable water balance, that at which they have good physiological functions, and they may do this with having special cells and special ion channels on their gills. They may have kidneys and so forth. And for example, you can see here Chinook salmon and freshwater eel maintaining constant salinities across internal salinities across a range of water salinities. So either osmoconformers or osmoregulators can live in an estuary if they have the right physiological adaptations to maintain their physiological functions in a wide range of salinity. There are some species that do a combination of both. They may osmoregulate at very low salinities, and here you can see this organism. This is a polychaete worm, is able to maintain its osmotic balance to some extent until it reaches about 25 practical salinity units. And then above that, it just lets its internal salinity content conform with that of the external environment. And it's able to do well at either of those, with either of those mixed strategies. So who lives there? We have various kinds of plants and animals that live in these habitats. And this is something where you could actually take a whole course on estuarine ecology. Sometimes Dr. Lindberg offers this, but we're going to go through a few of the key players. They differ a bit from some of the things we've seen in aquatic systems, in the freshwater systems, although some of them will overlap, as you'll see. So first we're going to talk about the plants and then the animals. So the flora, or the plants that live in estuaries, include some marine plants, seagrasses, and seaweeds. And they also include benthic algae, both species you've learned about in fresh waters as well as marine species. And they also include some salt marsh plants that we are not going to discuss more. That's a really specialized system, and you can learn more about it in a marine class. And there are tons and tons of bacteria and microbial processes that are going on. We talked about microbial ecology a bit, but we will not get into the microbial ecology of estuaries as much right now, but microbial ecology is an area of lots of study right now, as a lot of the microbial processes in these detritively driven systems are driving the whole ecosystem and the productivity. So here are some seagrasses. You can see them from the overhead view offshore there of the marine lab, and that's the green portions, and then the patchy portions are the sand. And these are really a lot like the higher plant macrophyte communities we discussed in wetlands and in littoral zones of lakes. Then we also have seaweed, so a kind of macroalgae, just as we had macroalgae in the deeper parts of lakes and as noxious blooms in lakes. We also have plankton that live in the open waters, just like we do in lakes and some big rivers. There's often a reduced species richness, just as we discussed in rivers. And phytoplankton tend to be dominated by two groups in particular, the diatoms, which you hopefully remember require a lot of silica, and dinoflagellates, which we mentioned can cause toxic blooms at times. And the zooplankton in these systems that are eating the phytoplankton tend to be dominated by copepods and some mysids. We talked about mysids a bit in fresh waters, and some amphipods, which can be benthic and pelagic. And the composition and biomass of the phytoplankton and zooplankton depends on a number of things, including the turbulence, how still or calm the water is, the turbidity, so how much light penetrates, and you can guess that if it's highly turbid, you should have fewer phytoplankton. Hopefully that's what you were thinking. And also the flushing rate. And as I mentioned, if you have a high flushing rate, all of these plankton would tend to get swept through the estuary and you wouldn't develop as large a population of plankton. The phytoplankton often have high nutrient levels because they are getting nutrients from the entire watershed of the rivers that are entering the estuary, as well as getting nutrients from the tidal inflow from coastal marine systems. Often, however, the ratio of nitrogen to other nutrients is such that nitrogen is the limiting nutrient in estuaries rather than phosphorus, as was the case in other freshwater systems such as lakes and rivers. More often phosphorus was limiting when we discussed that. And in addition, just like for some of the low water streams we discussed, the reduced light can also be limiting. So estuaries tend to be characterized by nitrogen and light limitation. And there are two dominant groups, representative of the dinoflagellates or the dinophyta and the diatoms. The zooplankton are generally dominated by copepods like this acartia on the right-hand side, but there are a few cladocerans like that bosmina there that live, that were more common in lake systems. And we get a number of fish larvae that live in estuaries. Again, it can be a nursery ground for fish. And this is a great picture from Dr. Lindberg. And in this picture, you can see this little fish larvae. And if you look closely at the bottom part of the picture, you'll see three little bosmina, three little zooplankton in the gut of that fish. So a lot of the larval fish in estuaries depend heavily on plankton as their first source of food when they're hatched from eggs in estuaries. So in the estuaries, we also get a large number of benthos, of benthic organisms living at the bottom of the estuary. And these are often, it makes sense, tolerant of low oxygen. And if they burrow, they often aerate their burrows because they are taking oxygen from the water above and mixing it into the sediment so that they're able to use aerobic respiration. There's a crab, there are many kinds of crabs in the benthos. And one thing that's really hard for us to imagine today is how many oysters used to line the estuaries of the northeastern coast of the United States. Oysters were a key component of estuaries of the Northeast. It's estimated that in the Chesapeake, the water in the Chesapeake, every liter of it passed through an oyster every day before before Western humans came to the system and industrialization came to the system. And oysters have had a lot of difficulty in our northeastern estuaries, in part because they're really the site of a lot of our major urban hubs. So New York City, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, all are on these major estuaries. And so what's happened is there was overharvesting because people like to eat oysters, and there was pollution from the watershed, from the cities. There were more anoxic and hypoxic events, and there were diseases that were brought in part from ballast water of ships and other sources. And all of these things, and there were also poisons that came from some of the anti-fouling agents that boats used to prevent things from growing on the boat and making the boat's path of travel inefficient. And so the number of oysters and the extent of oyster beds is extremely reduced in modern estuaries. So we may in part be seeing turbidity in estuaries because normally you'd have something like this where an estuary would be lined with oysters that are present on the bottom, and they would be filtering liters and liters of water each day, millions of estuaries. And today we don't have as extensive oyster beds, and so what happens then is that the water isn't filtered as much, and some of the turbidity that we think of as a characteristic of estuaries may be more emphasized today, maybe more turbid today, because the water is not going through these oysters, they're not removing all of the particles from the water. One of the major ways that people are trying to remediate the biology of estuaries is by trying to restart oyster reefs there, reduce pollution, start oyster beds, seed them, and try to increase the filtering capacity of them, and even start the potential for new harvesting, new industries, and restore our oysters to these systems. A bunch of other estuarine residents that are important to humans are fish. And so we can look at a few of these that you might have heard of. Bay anchovies, mummy chug killifish, mullets and drums, mud skippers that are those really interesting fish that can see in and out of water. There are a lot of them, especially in southern estuaries in the United States. We also get a lot of fish that use the estuary for part of their life cycle, or that move in and out of the estuaries. And so we have different species that migrate through. Some are transitional, that pass in and out of the estuary, and some are migrating regularly as part of their life cycle. So diadromous fish are fish in general that travel between fresh and salt waters. And we can have two general patterns, as you guys have undoubtedly learned before. Those that are catadromous, or that spend their adults in fresh waters, and their larval stages, they spawn in salt waters, such as the American eel. Eels are really fascinating. Almost all the eels in America and Europe spawn in one part of the Atlantic Ocean called the Sargasso Sea. And then the eels that you might catch in the Hudson or even in lakes around here, they came up from the ocean as larvae and matured in our rivers after having made this immense ocean voyage. And they'll live as adults in the estuaries until they go out to sea to spawn. And then we have the reverse, anadromous fish, fish that live in freshwater. Fish that live in the sea and breed in freshwater. And you guys might be familiar, say, with salmon having that strategy. But also a very common fish that has that strategy is American shad and also river herring. And then we have a number of species that are seasonal visitors. They come to the estuary periodically during different times of the year. And these include some things that people really like to fish for or are food for other important fish. Things like bluefish, flounder, and sort of the forage fish and the menhaden. And in addition, many invertebrates rely on estuaries as part of their life cycle and have these amphidromous life cycles. And so this is in the Gulf of Mexico. We have shrimp that are spending their juvenile stages in the Gulf and then coming into estuaries for part of their maturation process. And so this is part of why people get concerned about degradation of estuaries or things like oil spills at certain times of year where the organisms may be concentrated in one particular estuary and very susceptible to pollution during that life stage. Humans have had huge impacts on estuaries. More people now live within 100 kilometers or 62 miles of the coast than lived on the whole planet in 1950. And so with humans living so close to the coast and so many of our major cities being built on estuaries as places, again, where you had freshwater input that people could use for drinking water and good harbors, we really have had huge effects on our estuaries. And most places we have trouble reconstructing or thinking about what estuaries were like before human impacts were so severe. And so historically, people thought that wetlands should be reclaimed for human use, that they were basically wastelands, and people used them for housing developments. They filled them in, they drained them, built marinas and seaports and harbors and all things that were really important for developing our cities, but disturbed the natural ecosystem functions of estuaries. So humans, when they wanted to use these systems, and New York and London shown here are also built on these estuaries, they would dike and drain them, they would fill them, they would harden them. And it's estimated that a third of all estuaries in the U.S. are extremely degraded and have very little of their natural ecosystem function left. And that may be fine for some uses of estuaries, but for other uses of estuaries, it's something that people are trying to look at how we can reclaim or restore parts of them and restore some of that natural ecosystem function. Even the dredging of navigation channels can be disruptive, even if it occurs in a small portion of the estuary. Digging that larger channel allows river and ocean water to move through the system faster, and it can allow that to to move sediments around, to erode the area, to erode mud flats, and so that can really affect the marshes that are lining the shore and helping to prevent flood effects and storm effects. One of the most degraded estuaries that's been well studied is the San Francisco Bay Estuary. And the estuary was reduced in terms of the amount of lining marshes due to the habitation and the dredging and the filling from having 2,200 kilometers squared of salt marsh estimated in 1850 and less than 125 kilometers of marsh today. And so you can look at the left of the historical marsh, and all of that green is marsh, and you can look at the right and see those few patches of marsh. And so all of those organisms that are relying on that marsh habitat for part of their life cycle have much much abilities to breed and be returned to the estuary and returned to the ocean. In addition, we've discussed rivers a bit, and we'll be talking more in the last section of the course about some of the impacts that humans have had on rivers. And we've talked about dams and reservoirs. And so damming and reservoirs upstream also affect the amount and the quality of water that's brought down to the estuary itself. And they can reduce the freshwater flow. You may remember, and I would ask you if we were in class, what process would do that. Part of it would be the removal of the water from the reservoir for human use, but also just by slowing that water down on its path to the sea, we'd be increasing the potential for evaporation to operate at the surface of the reservoir and increasing that loss process of evaporation. So we'd lose a lot of fresh water that would have run to the sea to evaporation. In addition, we've often polluted the rivers upstream, and that all runs downstream. And we've also fertilized the land, and we have sometimes inadequate sewage treatment, and those things all run down eventually and end up in the estuary before flowing to the sea. And those extra nutrients, just like they could lead to excess production or eutrophication in lakes, can also lead to that extra production or eutrophication in the estuaries themselves. And what that has caused is strong algal blooms on the coast, in estuaries and coastally as a result of all that runoff from the land. And so there are increased zones of anoxia and hypoxia in the estuaries, and all of these little red blooms that you can see, red areas that you can see on the satellite, indicate high chlorophyll, high amounts of organisms, and in particular for this image, this satellite image, it's high amounts of algae from red tides, which can be toxic. So these have caused a lot of issues for the organisms that live in estuaries to have low oxygen concentrations, and increased amounts of blooms of toxic algae have really altered the natural food webs. In addition, we'll mention more about exotic species later, but because these are ports, humans are some of the main ways that we transport organisms around the earth, and things like the Asian clam and the green crab in the U.S. have come in. These can be important predators. It's estimated that in San Francisco Bay, there are now about 10,000 clams of Asian clams per square meter in some parts of the San Francisco Bay, and the green crab has spread all across the northeastern U.S., and these were transported in the ballast water of ships and moved from port to port, and they can displace native organisms and also spread diseases. So in some place like San Francisco Bay, that's a big port, there are far more than 200 exotic species that have been reported there and studied. We also have problems with overharvesting of both fish and shellfish. Again, that was one of the causes of the oyster declines. And as we try to remediate some of our problems of fishing in the ocean and develop aquaculture systems of some kinds that are put in estuaries and not multi-species kinds of aquaculture, but say single species of aquaculture. If you put fish in pens, like in this image here from Norway, where they grow a lot of salmon, you might have a lot of fish that's ground up and fed into these pens to feed these salmon, and then that increases nutrients in this estuary and can increase eutrophication there as well. So aquaculture can be great, and it can also be problematic if we have aquaculture that doesn't consider the inputs of pollutants and of nutrients to the system and its potential degradation of these estuaries. So That's our summary of estuarine ecology. Estuaries are fascinating places, and I encourage you to learn more about them in other classes and in other readings. On your handout, there are some readings that you could follow up on for learning more about estuaries. And again, these are where rivers are meeting the sea, where limnology is meeting oceanography, and they're places of human habitation. If you've gone to any of the major cities on the northeast coast, you've been at an estuary. And next time you go, see if you can look at some of these ecosystem functions, if you can see what the native estuary might have been like before we turned it into a city system. Thanks, and thanks for joining us, and I'll see you next time.